Nice.
What's up?
That's going to be better.
So the intro video was a tad bit shorter, like maybe 30 of the 32 seconds shorter, but guys,
Hey, it stopped.
it did. It did. That is true. You know what? It doesn't even matter because guess what, guys? We are officially live. Welcome to the first episode of the A to G Lifestyle Podcast with me, Andreas, and Gavin. If I had my soundboard, I would do the round of applause sound effect, but unfortunately, I don't have access to that at the moment. But it does not matter. We are here. Welcome wherever you're listening to this, whether you're listening to this right now live on Twitch, whether you're listening to this recorded on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode of the A to G Lifestyle Podcast. And we are about to get into it. I'm about to give sort of a little rundown about how this podcast is going to go. But before we get into that, obviously, I'm sure a lot of you have questions. If you followed me over the last few months, you know that I had another podcast that I started on my own, and that had to stop because the way that I had set that podcast up was it was supposed to be an interactive setup with me interacting with my followers and my community to see what they wanted me to discuss and to hear a fresh opinion about. That never really materialized. But what I did really enjoy about the other podcast was having guests on about every 2 weeks. But that also became a little bit hard to manage, you know, people's schedules changing, the whole shebang. But I thankfully have two wonderful gentlemen that I met, both of whom I met this year. I believe I met both of you this year. Am I correct? No. He says
You met me last year.
I met you last year. It must have been the end of last year then. Yeah, probably. You're probably right. I know I met Gavin for sure this year.
Yeah, no, you definitely met me this year.
Exactly. Okay, there we go. So I'm not entirely out of my mind here. But ultimately, I think this will be super fun. It'll be super fun to be able to discuss things with other people because that's ultimately what makes podcasting fun is the discussion that you get involved in with others. For this podcast in particular, the last podcast I had set up had started on the trend of discussing big issues at the moment, whether it be mental health related, just people feeling lonely. I wanted to get out into the world and give people a new perspective on life in that manner. This podcast will be able to take that, I think, to an entirely different level, just with the amount of conversation that we'll be able to have about a ton of world topics and the little principles behind those events and those issues that we can pull out and apply in our own lives, either directly or to figure out how we can respond to the things that are happening in our world. I think overall, this will be a fantastic way for us to encourage people during a time where it feels like encouragement is very much needed. And that's kind of the goal of this podcast, just to inspire new ways of thinking, to understand some of the realities of our life that are less discussed and less addressed. And of course, we want to encourage our listeners. Look across the screen right now. You see three very different individuals, both socioeconomically, whether it be racially or I guess ethnically, because we all know there's only one race, the human race, obviously. Whether it be socioeconomically, racially, occupationally, educationally, we are three very different individuals on this screen, but we all share one thing in common, and that is to be the best people, and for us in particular, guys, be the best guys we can be. So considering everything that has made us who we are to this point in our lives, obviously none of us are super old yet, but we're all adults at this point. What have we enjoyed in our development to this point, and what can we do to continue our development into adulthood, later adulthood, and older adulthood to make us the best guys that we can possibly be? Now, obviously, there's something that we share despite our several differences that I've already mentioned. It's the fact that we are all Christian. So you're going to hear a lot of content on this podcast that is brought from a faith-based perspective. When we're addressing issues, just know that our perspective has that faith-based aspect tied into it, and we're completely unashamed of that. Look, it's important that when we're discussing the realities at work in our world, whether it be news events or what have you, it's important that we approach things from the entire truthful perspective. And for us, I think one of the reasons why we are Christian is, number one, it's very reliable that there is a God that exists. And of all the gods that people across the world worship, it is very commonly known that the evidence is that the Christian God is the most reliable. Look, I just have one little tidbit of advice that I give myself on a regular basis. If some guy predicts his own death and resurrection, I just tend to follow whatever the guy says. So just know that for us personally, that is the perspective we're coming from. We're not asking you to be a Christian, but we sure hope that over the course of listening to our content, you start to see how our faith has transformed our lives and the way we live out our daily, day-to-day activities. And that is that. That's pretty much what the podcast will be about. I hope everyone enjoys the content that we provide to you on a weekly basis here. But other than that, we got some fun content to get into on this podcast. This will be such a fun journey. Kicking it off this week with a little bit of a different twist. So over the first month or so of this podcast, the first 4 weeks, we decided as a 3-person team that we are going to cover some of the biggest events from 2022, coupled with the biggest event that was happening over the last week prior to our recording. So over the next week, we'll probably have 2-hour-long episodes. They'll probably be individual episodes at that. Obviously, we're live streaming this one, so this is the exception. But usually we'll have 1 hour where we discuss one of the bigger issues from the year of 2022 in review, and then we'll discuss one of the bigger news stories from the past week prior to our episodes. And we get to kick off our very, very first podcast episode with one of the biggest news stories from not only 2022, but pretty much the entire last decade plus of time. And that is the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine was something that I don't know if a lot of people saw coming. Some people probably obviously did, but it was definitely a surprise to a lot of us considering what was happening at the time. If you want a very brief summary overview of what's happened at this point, is effectively going back to 2014, the Ukrainian revolution was in full swing, and Russia ended up annexing Crimea during that period of time. Russia went in, they took it over. And in addition to that, there were some regions in southeastern Ukraine that Russian-backed paramilitaries took over as well. I'm getting a call. Sorry. Of course, it happens at the worst time. But anyways, at this point in time, Russia had annexed Crimea, and there was paramilitary activity in Ukraine, and this was the beginning of a much more widespread issue. And it eventually culminated in March 2021 when Russia began sending large amounts of military troops and personnel to the southeastern border of Ukraine. And this ultimately culminated in over 150,000 troops being stacked at the Ukrainian border. That's a decent amount. That's a show of force right there. You don't just send over 150,000 military troops to a border if you're looking for peaceful conversation. So clearly Russia is building up some aggressive behavior here. And then ultimately this war kicked off this year in 2022 in February, when ultimately Russia recognized 2 of the breakaway regions in that southeastern low part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, as their own republics. And that gave way to President Putin giving the order for a special military operation in Ukraine, which has now led us to the war that we've now seen in that part of the world over the last 8-9 months plus. But I'm sure there's a much deeper background in history to this issue. It's more like a family matter. A lot of old Soviet Union ties and issues are coming back now in the present, and I'm sure Andreas has a lot he wants to discuss as it comes to those. So take it away, bud. What do you got for us?
So the conflict in Ukraine is probably much older than we in the West like to think it is. Most people in the West want to say that it started in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. However, the conflict actually began a year earlier with the Euromaidan protests in I think it's Kiev, if I'm not mistaken, because I'm pretty sure that's where that square is. But really, this conflict was coming. Was guaranteed to happen based on the basic philosophies that Putin had before this conflict even began. So the best way to think about it is to realize that Putin is not Western. And therefore, Putin is not going to be following Western philosophies and lines of thinking. In particular, Vladimir Putin is following a particular philosopher by the name of Alexander Dubin. And if you've read his work, the fourth pillar, Alexander, is it Dublin, something, doesn't matter.
Something like that. Close enough.
He's a philosopher. If you've read his book, you see that this Alexander guy, he wants to create a fourth political philosophy in the modern age, even though he's arguing for the end of modernity. Alexander Dugin says that there was three governing philosophies throughout the 20th century, that being liberalism, communism, and fascism. And he says that each one of these philosophies for governance is wrong in its own particular way. In particular, fascism had an issue with racism, and that ultimately led back to its downfall. Whereas communism, it was proven not to work. Was really its signature. How do you say, signature of why it failed? In that, it didn't survive in the Soviet Union. And he says that liberalism, which is what the world defaulted to after both fascism and communism died, is on a collision course that does not lead to prosperity and freedom ultimately. Dugin suggests that that the end state of this liberalism is a politic-free society, and we see that as actually coming true if you look and see the world as it is. He said that the politics are going to go away, and that it's all going to be curated by innovation and improvement, and that we're in an end game where that no longer exists, and it's going to be ruled by Western thought and Western decision making, and that is not a place for Russia to exist in, because ultimately, post-liberalism, the society and all things surrounding society are going to be controlled by the West, politics free, under control by corporations, and whatever the West deems important. So what Alexander Dugin discusses that the way for Russia to move forward is to break away from this liberalism path that the West has decided to go under, which means that Russia in particular is going to need to be able to be almost self-sufficient, and otherwise that's going to fall underneath the sway of the West and of globalism, as he warns of. So that's a very basic premise. So now we fast forward, understanding that very basic philosophy. We're not going to get deep into it. I've read the book once. It'd be too long to discuss. With that basic understanding, we now look at 2013 during the Maidan protest, in which there was a duly elected president of Ukraine who was pro-Russian. And this pro-Russian leader said that he wasn't going to sign and follow under the EU system. He wasn't going to sign and agree to those accords. And so what happened is this protest happened inside of the Maidan, and they pressured the Ukrainian leader to change his mind about the EU accords. The parliament of Ukraine later removed this pro-Russian Ukrainian president from power. And he was removed from power and replaced with a Western-leaning individual. Okay. We see, so now keeping that in mind, going forward a year, we see that Russia, who wants independence from the Western system, sees that since their previous ally in Ukraine, the pro-Russian, got removed, the pro-Russian Ukrainian leader got removed. Now they're worried that their ally is no longer their ally, and they're going to have to do something more drastic because they don't want to fall underneath the sphere, or Putin doesn't in particular want to fall underneath the sphere of the West and liberalism, because he sees it as a failing system. So Putin, using breakaway people in Crimea, begins a war in Crimea in order to secure a warm water port in Crimea, which is significant because it's very important for trade, especially if your ports are frozen over most of the year or a portion of the year. It's not useful. So he uses pro-Russian Ukrainians, as he claims, to break away Crimea from Ukraine, which begins this conflict. We also see that later, as Zelensky now becomes more and more pro-West with NATO, Russia then begins to move more and more into Ukraine, securing the oil pipelines and other resources, natural resources, that Russia sees as the only way to survive a Western control over Russia. That's what they fear ultimately, is Western control over Russia. And so seeing that the basic philosophy of Putin is I want an independent Russia that is completely separate from Western control, a lot more of this invasion begins to make sense. Because if he loses Ukraine, he loses all the resources of Ukraine, and he loses access to the warm water ports, and it becomes he would say, an existential threat to Russian independence, because they will then slowly be forced into the Western sphere and lose autonomy, and that would it would cause them to cease being Russian, and that's what he's concerned about, and that's the basic cause of this conflict, regardless of what the TV or the media say. It's really a fear of the West that has caused this to happen, and that's what's going on. Putin claims that the invasion into Ukraine, following the Luhansk and Donetsk, is that right? I don't remember.
Luhansk, Donetsk, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Secession is that he was claiming that Ukrainian Nazi forces, and I'm serious about that word Nazi, were committing genocide on Russian Ukrainians, ethnically Russian Ukrainians. And so he stated that he was invading Ukraine as a defensive exercise to stop the genocide caused by these Nazi Ukrainians. These Nazi Ukrainians are known as the Azov Battalion, by the way, and they are a real thing. However, the extent of them actually committing genocide is unknown, right? Because I couldn't find anything significant, but we don't know, right? It's a shadow of war, and we in the West have a tendency to want to view the West in the best light, and so we are going to ignore and not report anything that's not positive. So we would have to look at Russian sources, and I can't read Russian to understand what they're really saying about what's happening in Ukraine in regards to these literal Nazi, not like Americans call Nazis, Nazis.
Actually.
Yes.
Like the actual ones, not the sarcastic, let's just give you a bad name type, the actual ones, right?
Yeah. What they're actually up to in Ukraine. So that's what kicked off the war. So Russia sees this as a fight for survival for Russia. The West sees it as a fight for the West, and that's why NATO and all of the Western allies are very pro-Ukraine, because they want Ukraine to be a part of the West sphere of influence. And so this war is really a proxy war between the West and Russia, and we'll see what happens. But that's the very basic background of what's happening in Russia. Gavin, you want to talk about anything in particular of note that you want to talk about before we talk about further on in this war?
No, all the research I have is more post-invasion.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, well, all that I really have to say is just like going off of like that, like Putin's philosophy kind of thing. It's just like the initial invasion kind of, from a Western perspective, it looks really strange because, you have the amassing of troops on Ukraine's borders, like what Chris was talking about earlier. But the actual justification of war was just nobody really understood it. Because what you were saying about the like us not really agreeing whether or not the Azov battalion were really Nazis, to what extent they actually did commit genocide. All that we really saw was like, hey, Putin took Crimea from Ukraine, a sovereign nation, and then tried to launch an invasion to free separatist movements in the Donbass region. But when you look at how the actual, like invasion played out, you see that instead of actually going to try and liberate the Donbass regions, you see Russia make a really hard attempt to take the capital of Kyiv, which is just like, it just goes to show that Putin isn't really telling his entire truth with this invasion. But thankfully, the Ukrainians were able to push it back. But it's just the thing that I find so funny about it all is just the ineptitude of Putin's army and what the world that he built for himself was. Because at the beginning of the conflict, like pre-invasion, Russia was considered the second best army within the entire world. He thought that, he was going off of that basis of, I have the second best army in the world. What can Ukraine do against me? And, he wanted to reclaim whatever it may be, whether it be Ukraine's like positioning with Crimea and being the northern shore of the Black Sea, or just expanding Russia's sphere of influence, or getting a one-up on the West, whatever it may be. It just, when he actually invaded, it really showed the ineptitude of the Russian army and the state that Putin really had made in his mind. It proved that, no, he wasn't actually as invincible as he thought it was. Failing to take Kiev after a month and then basically entirely retreating from the north of Ukraine, to losing about 3 times as much military personnel or equipment as Ukraine did throughout the entirety of the war. To even, I think it's just so funny, like when he's thinking about like I want Russia to be separate from the West, because the West is really like eroding at what it means to be Russian. After the Ukrainian counteroffensives in the northeast, where they liberated Kharkiv, it's kind of funny because there are people within the Russian government, the Chechen leader, the son of the dictator of the Chechen Wars, and the leader of the Wagner group, the most successful group in the Russian invasion. They were both criticizing heavily, the retreat, and then up against them, who they were all both they were both very pro-war, pro-invasion. But also within the other Russian elite were like the other oligarchs, like these men. And some of them had ties to the West. They had not military, but economic ties to the West. That once this invasion really got going, they were like, no, this isn't good for us. You know, we need to back out from this invasion. We need to, you know, go back to something to where we can still conduct our business and still have this power that we've managed to obtain. And also another thing about like the Russian self-sufficiency, like Putin, he totally misread the situation there too, because like one of the hallmarks of this war is the like economic basis of it all, with the main weapon of the West not really being weapons, but the economic sanctions that we've placed on Russia. And while they definitely have not immediately tanked the Russian economy, Russian manufacturing is down across the entire board. And the only reason their economy is still propped up is because of government spending, that the reserves are, you know, going to dwindle within a couple years if they actually keep it up at this pace. And I just think it's all super ironic with Putin's framing of the war and how it just seems to be some sort of mind game with the West and some sort of mind game he's playing with himself, honestly.
No, that's a great point. And I think it just goes to show, look, this guy, he's a leader of a country. He has completely, in his own mind, he's completely justified his invasion of Ukraine to this point. In his own mind, he has justified it. He said, look, the ideological differences threaten my existence. The lack of access to resources threatens my existence. I really don't see any reason why I should continue just taking this from every other society in the West that's just developing beyond belief. And I'm starting to now feel like a minority. So in his mind, he's completely justified his invasion. He has made it seem like he is somehow, in all this madness, the one who's being attacked and persecuted. And I mean, I guess in a sense he is, but you know, nonetheless, you can't. One has to ask themselves. You can't say, yeah, I'm really only looking at this particular part of this country, but you know, I'll just continue bombing the capital. Like you know, like it's nowhere close. So he has a completely different agenda than whatever he has actually portrayed publicly, and that's becoming very, very apparent. But it's also important to note that he has some teammates. He has some people on his side here, outside of just the Russian government. I believe, who is it? The Belarusian president? Isn't he supporting Russia's attempts here?
Yeah, that's correct. And India, by the way, has been showing more pro-Russian argumentation in their country as compared to pro-Western as well. Same with Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. So it's really going down to pro-West versus pro-Russia as a discussion of what's happening, which is interesting. And that's why, you know, not everybody voted to sanction Russia at the beginning of this war, if I'm not mistaken. My memory is not always the greatest, but that is something that occurred.
Okay. You know, another thing I think is really striking about that whole detail is like the UN sanction, not the UN sanction, like the US condemnation of Russia's invasion. And it's like, it shows like the world stage. It kind of shows where things are at right now. Cause you know, most of the world voted to condemn Russia. You know, all of the West did pretty much. But it's like, there's a couple key players that there were only 5 nations that didn't, like, that voted to not what is the word? Like vote. Yeah, not condemn Russia. It was, you know, Russia, Belarus, North Korea, all very predictable ones. Then Eritrea and the Gulf of the Red Sea, right above Ethiopia, and Syria. And I think, you know, those ones are just kind of funny examples of like the ideological aspect of everything, because Eritrea is a totalitarian state, ranked among the most dictator, like, I don't know if that's the right word, but they're ranked among the most totalitarian states on the planet. And then it just, like in Syria, it's it just goes to show the control that Russia's been able to like I don't know the right word for it, but like impress on other nations outside of Russia's borders successfully, like with the Syrian civil war that the West just kind of forgot about back in 2018. But I think the really interesting part of the UN vote was the countries who abstained. Because if you look at the map, all of the West they voted to condemn it, but most of the East voted to abstain. I think the most important players that voted to abstain are China and India.
Yep.
Which is just like, China's a little bit more predictable, but I didn't really see India coming. That one, that's a little bit surprising for me.
They snuck in the back door while you were sleeping. Surprise.
Literally.
Well, isn't India a BRICS nation, if I'm not mistaken?
A what? What was that?
A BRICS nation?
Oh,
Isn't
not
India
sure.
BRICS?
Yeah, I believe they are. Yeah, I believe you're right.
Yeah. So they're under the Russian sphere if they are a BRICS nation.
Yeah, and too, like one of the other things like with India is with all of the embargoes and sanctions in the West, like oil stopped flowing west and went like almost exclusively to the east. Like China and India have been buying up Russian oil at stupid cheap prices, but it's like India has also been doing that as they've like from what appeared like of the past, I don't know, a couple decades or so, they've kind of appeared to be like a Western-ish ally, but this war is it's placing it a little bit more questionable. But I think another really big country to kind of pay attention to in the abstaining is Iran. And Iran raises another really interesting point about the war, because as it progressed further and further, it showed itself to be one of the first conflicts in which drones were really being widely used across the battlefield. And Ukraine's been getting all of their drones from the West, because the only reason that Ukraine is really still a state is because of Western support. But Russia ran out of its drones and has been using Iranian ones. And there's been a deal brokered. I don't know if it's been formalized yet, but there's been at least rumors of a deal to order more drones from Iran, and also ballistic missiles, both long and short range, from Iran. I don't know the effectiveness of it, but it's like Russia is now having to, it's relying on its sphere of influence. And I don't know really what that looks like for the future, because of China. And China, they've placed their lukewarm support for Russia. They're not condemning the war. They're not framing it as an invasion or a war at the G20 summit, which is like, it's a little shady on their part, but it just kind of seems like that was what Iran was doing at the beginning of the conflict too. And now Iran is supplying Russia. What happens when, Iran runs through its supplies of drones and ballistic missiles? Who do they go to next? Because there's no way that Russia's going to really back down from this conflict. It's too far in now.
They can't afford to. Yeah.
So
Putin doesn't think he can back down from this, right? Because then he loses Ukraine, right? And that's more of a threat than anything else, right? If he's wanting to have independent Russia, you can't lose the breadbasket of Europe. It's not something you can do, right?
No, of course not. And I mean, Gavin brought up a great point. The fact that the Western world has voted to sanction and kind of condemn Russia, but at the same time, Russia does still have its allies. They still have people who they can engage in business with. China is one of the bigger ones, obviously, that we've seen recently. I've heard that Putin is trying to partner with Xi Jinping on a few things, namely among which was that they tried to, like, I think, develop a currency or agree on like an agreement to develop a currency that would eventually take over from the United States dollar as the most dominant currency on the world stage. I don't know where that is at this point in time, but the point is that he has allies that he is developing relationships with, and it's working. Like you said, India, China, they're still engaging in business deals with Russia, despite the West significantly sanctioning Russia and trying to push them out of the West as much as possible, which is why we see things like high energy prices skyrocketing across the Western hemisphere. You got, I mean, in the United States, obviously our high inflation was due to more than just the Russian issue. There are some other domestically developed problems that we need to work out on our end, but certainly the whole Russian issue doesn't help. I mean, they provide some of our oil, and not even some, but a lot of our oil. So the fact that we don't want to drill here makes it more difficult for consumers to get affordable heating and energy here. In Europe, Germany is significantly feeling the brunt of this too, because it gets cold. Let me tell you, I've not been to Germany, but it gets cold in Germany in the wintertime, man. Let me tell you, I can believe that. And one of the biggest supplies of heating energy to Germany was one of the pipelines that goes into Russia. I think it's Nord Stream. Was it Nord Stream?
Yep.
Nord Stream
1?
1, yeah.
Nord Stream 1,
Yep.
yeah, because they I think what Nord Stream 2 didn't really work out properly, I don't think.
It got shut down by the U.S.
Yeah, we shut it down. Okay, that sounds about right. Pretty much. That sounds, I can believe that. That sounds about right. But yeah, so Germans and a lot of people in Europe are going to be experiencing high energy prices. This is the price to pay for just making sure that things like this don't happen in future to the best of our ability, right? So it's painful, but at the same time, like you said, Andreas, Putin really has no reason to back down. He still has his business partners. He still has people who are going to be able to buy oil from him and engage in business with him. So he really has no reason to change course at all, really.
And we're still going to be buying oil from Russia, even though we're sanctioned, right? If I'm not mistaken, and I can be, it's something like if it's 49% Russian oil and 51% something else and it's blended, we're able to buy that oil.
Really?
Yeah.
Dang. Dang. Nice. Nice.
And if I remember correct, back when the sanctions first started, I think it was Kazakhstan that Russia was shipping oil to, and then they were shipping out the Russian oil, calling it Kazakhstani oil, and we were buying that too, at a higher, more premium price. So these Russian oil sanctions really didn't do anything to Russia. And I was listening to Robert Barnes, brilliant guy. You should listen to him. He always picks the underdog fight, regardless of who's fighting. That's just who he is. And he was talking about the Russian oil and how Russia was doing better since these sanctions because of the price of the oil, which is very interesting. Because as that price goes up, Russia's able to sell it at a higher price, even to us through the sanction. Right? You can get around the sanction by mislabeling where the source is from, etc., blending it with other sources, and that has no effect on Russia. I was listening to an oil guy out of Texas, don't remember his name, but he was saying something like he's thinking that before these sanctions, Russia was making, I think it was $10 a barrel in profit from the oil. That after the sanctions, Russia was making something between $50 and $60 of profit per barrel after the sanctions went onto Russia because of the difficulty to get Russian oil to the U.S. So that's very interesting, and it also explains why the Russian economy hasn't really collapsed as the West would like it to, because their chief export is still being sold to the West at a much higher price and at much higher profits. So that's very interesting. And Chris, you're talking about European energy, and it's a good time to think and talk about that. Europe is heavily reliant on Russian natural gas for their power because Europe has mainly stopped a lot of their coal production and coal power and has been moving more towards wind and solar, and has a plan to decommission the vast majority of their nuclear plants because for some reason Europe is not a fan of nuclear, which means that in the interim, until the technologies develop for wind and solar, they're reliant on Russia's natural gas for power, which is very, very interesting to watch. As you know, that's a potential switch that Russia could use to completely shut off natural gas if they haven't done it already to Europe, which would be significant.
Yeah, also on that nuclear note, I like
Oh man, on that nuclear note,
I'm not okay. I'm not talking about like nuclear weapons or anything
no,
because
no,
that one's just, huh.
that's a
That's
fun topic.
yeah, that's a very fun topic, but
Very.
I'll keep it a little bit more boring. We'll talk about Zaporizhia instead. How about that?
Sure.
So, you know, Chernobyl back in the 80s, that was like one of the big reasons of like, oh my God, nuclear energy. It's a big spooky thing. And Zaporizhia right now it's reinforcing that fear. Because you know it's on the east bank of whoa, I get to be the
Yeah,
big talker
magic.
now.
Magic. For those of you who are listening to the audio version of this, we just zoomed in on Gavin's face.
Yeah.
Make him look a little bit more appealing when he's talking to the audience.
Oh yeah, like my blur, it looks so good right now
It's so
too.
beautiful. Just the way
Oh
the blur
yeah.
just accents your nose. It's fantastic.
But the main border that's being like formed within Russia or not Russia, Ukraine right now is along the Dnipro River. I think that's how you say it. But it's a massive river in Ukraine. It's not crossable except by bridge. And on the east bank of it is the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. And I don't remember when it was that it was captured, but it was captured sometime over the summer. And since then has been a big, and it's a big red flag just on either side of the conflict. You know, Russia holding it, that allows for potential mismanagement of a nuclear plant, and that's Europe's biggest plant by far, since because of the aforementioned shutdowns of like Western European nuclear plants, but also it's just the big scary thing about that plant is there's still fighting going around it. There's still fighting going on around it. There's shellings going on. I think there was a report I saw yesterday from the IAEA. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's the big nuclear commission of the world. It's the international one. But they posted a report yesterday that said that it had been offline, like the power to keep the plant running is starting to dwindle a little bit more due to increased shelling around the plant, and what the power, like what the loss of power means for that power station is it's not going to be able to maintain the systems to regulate the nuclear material. It's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily have this like potential to be like a Chernobyl kind of disaster where it's just complete and total meltdown. But what it does have the potential to do is get out of reasonable control right now. It has the potential to melt down a little bit, to put it out of use for quite a while, and also emit some radiation into the area. And especially since it lies along the bank of the river, that's a big source of Ukraine's fresh water. And should it be poisoned with anything nuclear or radioactive, that's downstream of that point. The water won't be able to be trusted. And it's just, if it's not managed correctly, if that reactor isn't managed correctly, it has the potential to go very south very quickly. And I've heard rumors that Russia is planning on withdrawing from the area, which pray to God that is true.
We can all pray, can't we?
Yeah. But yeah, no, that's just like that's one of the big things that I when researching for this, it was just that just stuck out in my mind. Just the disaster potential held within one little industrial complex, really.
Yeah, that's very true. So what are the four things when it comes to survival? What are the four most important things? I think there are four, right? What is it? It's food, shelter, water. Is there another one? What's the other one? Help me out here.
Oxygen. I don't
Oxygen.
know.
That is usually an important pre-qualification for survival of humans. Yes, you're absolutely correct. I don't remember what the other one is, but food, water, shelter. This event is significantly impacting pretty much all of those. So we've seen with energy right now, right, with the oil prices going up and the sanctions that have caused several countries to reduce their reliance on Russian oil for natural gas and energy. And then we've also seen, like you were just talking about, the nuclear effect too. There are several different aspects of energy at play here. But then you got food too. I mean, Ukraine is the world's top producer in a lot of different agricultural products. If I'm not mistaken, I think it made up like 40 something percent of their overall exports in 2021. That is their primary export. Things like sunflower meal, oil, sunflower meal, one word. There you go. You're welcome. Sunflower meal, oil, seed, stuff like that. So, I mean, this country is being absolutely bombarded by another nation. This is a lot of stuff that is grown outside. So, I mean, another question I guess we could ask is what is the future of the Ukrainian economy once this war does come to an end, if it does in the near future?
Very bad. The prospects are not good. Um, they're just, the Ukrainian agricultural industry might be able to survive, like be able to enough to, scrape by, but it's not going to be anywhere near the extent to where it can, feed half of Africa like it has been, or the Middle East, or it's not going to be able to be like as big of a breadbasket as it was before the war. But just other parts of the economy, especially with the Donbass region, like whatever happens there, like if Ukraine ever, takes back the Donbass region, that's where most of the industrial activity goes on. It's the shortening of the Donetsk basin, which is like really it's packed with a lot of coal. So there's just by nature it's very industrial, but that's where the bulk of the fighting of this war really is. It's in that region, and should Ukraine be able to take it back, those places are going to be completely shelled. They're going to need quite a while to repair, but also on the aspect of repair, Russia, they've kind of been shifting their tactics a little bit. I don't remember what his name is. I can't remember any of the names in this war. I can't even pronounce half of them. But he was the Russian general in the Syrian civil war, and he was known as the Butcher of Syria because he targeted civilian infrastructure. And
Must be a fun guy.
oh my God, he's such a fun guy. Every picture you see of him online, he's like,
Oh man.
but
Wow, what a
he
guy.
like the reason why he's important to the conflict is, as one of the high ups, I think he's in charge of Army Group South. He's able to influence where the rocket strikes go, and the rocket strikes have been going towards thermal plants within Ukraine. They've been going to the electrical grid. They've been going, to like civilian infrastructure is the point that I'm getting at. And whether or not, like, it's obviously a war crime. It's targeting specific areas to cause suffering is a war crime, and that's what Russia's doing right now. It also it's going to place a hamper on reconstruction efforts, and also to just the ability of Ukraine to really exist as a nation after this war, should they be able to win it. Scary stuff.
Oh, indeed. I can imagine. Actually, no, I can't imagine. That's a lie. I can't imagine. But yeah, I mean, it really doesn't seem like a win for Russia here in any regard, right? So you bomb the civilians, you get them out to take the resources, and then you've bombed the city so much that the pollution has increased and those crops may be a little bit less healthy. So now the resources that you wanted from there, if you wanted them in the first place, which it sounds like he kind of does, those are going to be harmed. It's just really not a win-win for anybody involved, it would seem. I don't know. What else do we make of this at a very general level?
Yeah, it's just at this point in the war, there's no real winner. Like what you're saying, it's just all the infrastructure is going to be destroyed. All the real resources are going to take a while to actually be able to recuperate, like a couple of years. A very, very generous guess, but most likely a decade of rebuilding. But it also just on the on the aspect of nobody winning the war. And also to tie back to an earlier point about like Germany feeling the brunt of like, the sanctions being propped up so heavily by, Russian gas. It shows the global nature of this conflict. The US is, we're bordered by two countries and surrounded by ocean on two sides. We're a really safe country, and yet we've been feeling the pinch here as American citizens by a war halfway across the planet. And that's the really big thing about this war, is whether or not like anybody wins at the end of this conflict. And what it might actually take to get to the end of the conflict. Andreas, do you have anything to say on that?
Not really. I was just wondering what if we should discuss the American involvement in this conflict from the beginning through now, and what you guys think about it. Do you want to start there, Gavin, or should I?
I mean, I'll give it to you. I've been talking a little bit.
Okay, sure.
The floor is yours, sir.
So we kind of were majorly involved in the starting of this conflict. If you go back to that Maidan protest, there was some leaked phone calls between the opposition parties and the U.S. in regards to the replacement of the Russian president. And it could be assumed and thought that we directly interfered within that democratic process in Ukraine to replace out that Russian pro-Russian president, which we did. And then we have us now giving millions upon I think billions of dollars to Ukraine in aid. Is quite significant, showing what we as Americans, and by we I mean the government of America, truly value in Ukraine. So Russia's thought of this being an actual fight between the West and Russia is completely valid. Personally, I hate to say it, but we're spending a lot of money on Ukraine when a lot of that money, right, that we don't have, right, should much better be spent in the United States on the issues that we have going right now. But we're sending, $40 billion to Ukraine. I don't know if that's the wisest move, especially when that appears more antagonistic towards Russia, right? But it's the only thing that's keeping Ukraine from falling to Russia completely is the U.S. and European aid. So that's the question there. Any thoughts, Chris?
Oh man, you telling me we can't just print unlimited amounts of money from the sky and just help whoever we want? Is that what you're telling me right now?
Chris?
Bro, no way. You tell me the more money that is in circulation, the less purchasing power that people have? No.
Crazy.
Crazy, dude. Insane. But yeah, I mean, we are spending a lot of money in Ukraine. I think a package that is most memorable to me, at least, was the one that was like 40 billion, I think.
Yeah, 40
Yeah,
billion.
just recently, yeah.
Yeah, so we sent like 40 billion to Ukraine. I mean, that's a lot of money. We sent them some stuff too. Didn't we send them like actual fighting, like military tools,
Yeah.
like planes and stuff? So yeah, so we're sending them a lot of stuff. We're sending them tons of stuff that they need to keep from falling. Like you said, the question is, why are we so involved? Do we feel like we have to be involved over in Ukraine just because we are the United States and we kind of set the precedent, or we like to think we set the precedent for worldwide events that are happening in pretty much every part of the world, right? We got our hands in almost everything. We got big hands and we dip them in a lot of places. But that's really the question: what is the point of us continuing to fund this effort? Why are we doing this? Obviously, it can be viewed as a good thing that we are helping them stay alive, right? But the question is why. So I don't think we quite really know why, besides the fact that we don't want Russia to take the country. But yeah, I think there are definitely a lot of domestic issues that we could be addressing with 40-50 billion dollars in our own country. It's just an interesting all around issue. Any of you guys have any opinions on why you think we have such an investment in keeping Ukraine alive?
Yeah, so when we talk about the West, we're usually talking about like NATO or the EU. And if you look at who really like has the geopolitical power within, first of all, NATO is an American organization. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And then EU is, it takes not necessarily like takes a lot of inspiration, but it draws some inspiration from the United States. And we're also one of, if not their biggest trading partners aside from China. So we control a significant amount of, the West. We're the big economic like backing of most of it. And with Ukraine, being the breadbasket of Europe and also a significant chunk of the world, it keeps up the order that keeps us at the top, which I will say is, I think it's probably, all things considered, one of the better world orders. There is Pax Americana for a reason. But I just think that, like, since Russia is, I don't know if like the East is an adequate term, but like like whether or not, like, I feel like they are the enemy to the West in which we lead. And, having, it's just kind of like back in Soviet times, like domino theory. What happens if Russia takes Ukraine? Who's next? Is it like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, like Finland? Is it Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Georgia, all of those places? It's just kind of one of those things that's just like on a bigger scale. It just kind of, in order to keep the position that the U.S. is in right now, to be the world hegemon, Russia can't be expanding its borders. And that's my hot take on why we're fighting so hard in Russia. But I definitely do think that there are some issues at home that need to be addressed before we really go spend $40 billion in a country that before this year, nobody cared existed. So, I don't know. What do you guys have to say on that?
Well, I think we cared it existed at the very least, right? We were using it as gas for Europe, basically, right? With that Hunter Biden thing, right? When he was on that board of Burisma, that gas company in Ukraine. So it was on the radar for the political elites, at least all the way back underneath the Obama presidency, and it was on the political radar when they switched the president in Ukraine uh, from the pro-Russian president to the pro-Western president. So it's been on our radar, just not on the radar of the average American citizen until recently.
Yeah, I guess that's what I meant more so by us. Sorry.
I
Yeah,
figured.
should have clarified that.
Because it has been on the radar of the government for a while, at least what we can see, and that's pretty significant, right? For America saying we don't interfere in elections, and when we did in Ukraine, that's pretty shady of us to do. If I was to switch hats and put on my conspiracy theory hat, right? We had all of this money that went into Ukraine just recently, right? And as they like to say, is fake news because there was no proven connection yet. But FTX was helping get donations and manage income, right, for Ukraine, for donations and support and all that stuff for their war effort. And then that FTX being one of the biggest donors to the political class within the 2022 election season, not just to Democrats, but to Republicans as well, specific Republicans. And then that FTX being found that they weren't solvent and didn't have money in their coffers, which is what led to that big scandal. As what was it, $2 billion went missing right after they donated to the political class. It makes you wonder if if it's not corruption that America has interest in Ukraine, right? Where we're giving money to Ukraine in exchange they're giving money back to the political elite for whatever they want to do with that money. That's
Yeah.
just a conspiracy, right? Because you can't prove that, but that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Even though they say it's fake news because you can't prove that connection, but that's what it looks like to I think a lot of people, and why we're so heavily involved in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's definitely a fair point. We love it when conspiracy Andreas comes out. We love it when that hat comes. Look, the cowboy hat's amazing, but I think our favorite hat is the conspiracy hat. Is there a conspiracy hat?
There's
Oh,
a conspiracy.
that can't be the conspiracy hat. Hang on a second. I like that one. That's my favorite of the two. For those of you who don't know, this is this man's new calling card, the cowboy hat. Not even new. It's been a thing for years. That's where all of the wealth of knowledge that he has is just stored up. So he reads something online, it just gets stored in the cowboy hat, just ready for
Is this more conspiracy for you guys?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. I couldn't have imagined anything more conspirator than that.
Now you just need like a silver cone, like a tinfoil cone on top of it. It'll be perfect.
Yeah, we can make it happen. I believe we can make that happen. Yep. Oh man. But I mean, overall, that's pretty much a good summary of the background of the overall issue practically. But now I kind of want to change course a little bit here. I'm very curious to see what your guys' initial impressions are as to why an individual would engage in such activity. Why would somebody engage in starting a war, even if they feel like they've been victimized? Why would somebody do this at heart?
Well, just kind of like, oh yeah, Andreas, you go.
Yeah, okay, Gavin, you got this.
Okay, well, I was just gonna say it's just like with that, like West versus East idea. You look at the map, the West did kind of win the geopolitical battle in a sense. And Russia's kind of a lone dog right now. It's not necessarily entirely alone, as shown by the abstaining in the UN condemnation vote. But it's just kind of like when you look at the real friends that Russia has, you can't even really consider China on the list at this point. And they're the closest thing that, Russia really has to like a concrete backer that would really keep them in power. But it's like when you have Finland on the border of Russia, like flirting with NATO membership and EU membership, and Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania right on the border becoming NATO members, and Poland, and Romania, and Moldova, and Turkey, and Georgia. It's really basically on the Western side, except for Ukraine and Belarus. They really are kind of backed into a corner. And when you have that in such a globalist world, it doesn't really bode well for if someone across the world who you buy things from says, we're not a big fan of you, and then jacks up tariffs because of it, it doesn't really bode well for you. So you have to take some action for it. And not all of Putin's gears they're not all clicked into the right places. So he thinks that this is most likely his best option, but I don't know.
Well, if you were Putin, do you see a better option if you think the way he does?
Oh no, definitely not. The only better option I can think of is no Russian oligarchy or Putin. But that's not something that Putin wants. So
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. So going back to our initial discussion, this is in Putin's mind his only hope of Russian independence from the Western sphere, right? And if you don't trust and or believe in liberalism, right, and post-liberalism, which is what we're entering into, then you know this is your only bet, right? If the world is controlled by one political ideology, and that ideology is said that politics is over, right? Which is what Alexander Dugin's saying, the philosopher behind Putin, right? The person that Putin studies and understands. Then you've got to have another pillar, and this is his hope to make that happen was Ukraine, right? Controlling the resources in Ukraine, having a united Eurasia, right, under its own pillar, under Russian control, and that's his option, right? That you know you can't really do anything else, right? He's not China. He can't cut off manufacturing or anything like that, or increase tariff or whatever to gain authority, right? This is all he's got, and so I think that's what we're seeing, and that's why it that's why he's doing what he's doing. So
Yeah, so it's like preservation of ideology effectively to make sure that his way of thinking isn't entirely wiped from the face of the planet with this new dominant Western way of thinking effectively, right?
yeah,
Yeah, so I think that's true. So I guess we could probably see that then from maybe a pride perspective. So he takes pride in the ideology that he and the Russian government and all his officials and everyone who's on his side of the issue take. It's a pride thing, and I think we see that a lot because
well, it might not be a pride thing, Chris. He might genuinely think that the West is evil,
that's definitely true. That's
right?
definitely
And so he's not thinking of this as a pride thing, but he may be thinking, well, the West is evil, and I am not as pride, but I am trying to defend freedom in his mind, right?
yeah.
Freedom from the West. So
Oh yeah.
he might not think of it as pure pride or think of it as pride. He might think of it as, I guess the word would be altruism, even though it's destructive, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
He's saving the world in his mind from the West.
Yeah, that's fair. I can see that. I can definitely see that.
Well, Russia will, not him, right? But
Exactly. Well, I think even then, the underlying issue is that why do you want freedom, right? It's because you enjoy freedom. You enjoy living in a society where you feel like your ideology is free to dominate, right? And I mean, even then, you could kind of take aspects there and say, yeah, this is something that I want because I think it's good, effectively, right?
right.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not uncommon that we see that. Obviously, he's also preserving or attempting at least to preserve in his mind the power that he holds. So, you see power and pride as two very big players here underlying that kind of have snuck into his decision making process, whether he realizes it or not. Obviously, we can only see the output of what he's telling us at the world stage, what he is projecting publicly. And honestly, not even all the time when we make decisions do we consider the underlying reasons why we're making them in the heat of the moment or in a general span of time within that moment. But I think it's important because we do see this as something that a lot of people in the world today want. They want to preserve who they think they are and who they want to be, right? In a sense.
Mhm.
And it's interesting. It's interesting what some people will do for power to maintain what they want out of their lives. I think that's an interesting issue. Does anyone have any opinions on the issue of like power and the struggle for power recently in society? That seems to be a trend.
I kind of think that like the heart of the issue here is just like that hold on power that Putin really wants. He's built up this life around himself where he's able to do all the things that he wants. Russia is a personality dictatorship at this point. The Russian state really just kind of revolves around Putin. And it's just kind of like that self-preservation of like, I do not want to lose all of these things that are built up around me, that I've worked so hard for. And at some point, in like Putin's case, it's like the institutions that he's built in place, they're not right. They're corrupt. They're, destructive, repressive, all of these not good things at all. And I kind of feel like that's really like, it's kind of where I feel like we might be able to draw some sort of lesson from the conflict for ourselves. It's like we have to be analyzing what we are doing within our lives, being like, hey, this is something that I did. This is something I'm doing. This is something that I might be doing. Is it really, what I should be doing? Is this the best for me? Is this best for those around me? Is this best for what my future might be like? Will I come to regret this issue? And it's like, if you can say that, yeah, no, I'm going to be fine with this action that I'm currently doing right now, I'll be fine in the future. It won't negatively affect me, or it won't negatively affect the people around me. I feel like we need to have that kind of internal process going on. Just be like, is this right with God? Like, is this right for everybody? And that's something that I feel like Putin, he's not doing at all right now.
Ain't that the truth? I can believe
Yeah.
that. What do you think, Andreas?
Well, I think, I think it's definitely not right what he's doing, um, from that scope. And when we as Christians think about doing something and doing something for rightness, right? We ought to be thinking, am I doing well? We are already thinking, are we doing the right thing? But that's not always the case, right? I was listening to Jordan Peterson a while ago,
Oh,
and
yes.
he was talking about how in Nazi Germany, right, there's a 90% chance you'd be a Nazi, right? Even though we think that we wouldn't be, right? And so oftentimes, right, where Putin's thinking he's fighting for traditionalism, fighting against neoliberalism, fighting against globalism, fighting against the West, right, in order to preserve Russia, he's not thinking about, is he the bad guy in the situation, right? And likewise, we need to think, okay, is what we're advocating for, what we are doing, actually making us the villain of the story, right? And that's something that we don't think about, or when we do stuff, right? We think that we're right on whatever scope we're going to be right about, and we're going to push that through. And that's not a good way to think. And that's why Putin's doing what he's doing, right? He's doing what he thinks right, and not thinking about, right, what is actually right, right? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. And I think that's one of the problems with today is that we assess things, we've conflated truth and opinion. And in a sense, it's given us a problem. The problem it's given us is that we don't know or are willing to refuse to know or even consider whether the actions we're taking are actually right objectively. I think it goes back to something that's kind of important. This is not something I've actually really ever heard anyone talk about. If you go back to the beginning of the Bible, the Old Testament, the beginning of human time, when we're in the garden before the fall, you do see that the way Satan tempts Eve to eat the fruit is by telling her that by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that she'll be able to be like God, knowing good and evil. And then later, towards the end of that chapter, Genesis chapter 3, you see God make sort of this proclamation, this statement. out to just, I guess, the universe or whoever's listening, his creation, effectively. And what he says is that, look, now man has become like us. Notice, by the way, the us there is capital US. It's kind of hinting at the Trinity there. But not the point. The point is that he makes a proclamation. He says, man has become like us, knowing good and evil. In my interpretation, it was never God's intention for us to actively live with knowledge of good and evil. It was just supposed to be us living in his presence and him providing what we need to survive in his presence. And the fact that we know good and evil and use good and evil on a regular basis to analyze decision making. Is this good? Is that good? Is this good? Is that good? Is this good? That good? Just that kind of approach to life. There's a reason why it was never meant for us to live life that way, is because we are creation and we're imperfect. We can use our free will to disobey God, which is obviously what Adam and Eve did. But it goes back to the idea that when there's good and bad, there's also the ability to compromise, right? Where you know what the good thing to do is, and you know that this other option may not be as good, but it's not necessarily bad, which technically it might be bad, but you're willing to compromise. And compromise is very, very painful to objective success in life. Compromise, I like to say this, I like to say that selfishness is the enemy of compromise, but compromise is the enemy of the truth, right? So when we're not strictly focused on who we were created to be as people in the image of God, to walk with him regularly in his presence, then we start to become literally the own God of our lives, and just make decisions that we think are right or we think are wrong and avoid those as such. So it's very interesting to see that concept at play here. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, just going back to what Andreas was saying about like whether or not Putin thinks he's right or not, and just that issue of like when we get to play God and when we get to decide right or wrong, it really just, it develops like on some extreme scales a war in Ukraine. But it's just I want to like see if we can explore like that concept and how to apply it more to like our individual day lives, and like how we, like what I decide is good and if it's really good or not, or like if it's good or with God or not, and I guess that's just something like, because Andreas raised a really good point. Like, Putin might genuinely view the West as evil and evil upon the world that he's cleansing it of. And us on the Western side, we're like, yeah, no, Putin's evil, and we're propping up Ukraine to, fight against evil. But like, with what Andreas was saying about being involved in an undemocratic election back in 2013, like, where are our own actions drawing past the line that God drew? Like, what are we doing that's like not necessarily walking with God, if that makes sense?
Mm.
Well, a good way to think, right, is right now in America, right, we have this wonderful, beautiful cultural war that's happening, right, and both sides, are waging it differently, and some think, okay, I'm going to do what's in my power to ostracize and remove a specific group of people from talking because I think that's what's right. Whereas the other side is saying we're being removed from society. We're going to build our own thing, right? And they mock or they belittle or do whatever to the opposing side back and forth, right? And they're both deciding, right, what they think is right. The right thing is to silence speech. The right thing is to mock somebody else or silence speech back, right? And that's the conundrum, right? And that's what we're doing right now. Is it really the right thing, right? Personally, to say you have a view that I disagree with, so I'm going to prevent you from saying it, right? And
Mm.
that's why we as the West don't understand Putin, right? Nobody talks about or wants to understand what his philosophy is, right? It's a risk to discuss his philosophy
Hmm.
because that's not approved. It's not approved thought to think that liberalism is leading to no politics, no discussion of ideas, and that it's the death of mankind, right? You can't
Hmm.
talk about that. You can't say that because one side or the other side is going to prevent you from talking about or thinking about that idea. And we do that. We do that quite often, right? Or within Christendom, right? We discuss other groups within Christendom and say they're obviously wrong about this, that, and the other thing, and then we judge them and state that they're immoral or they're um, sticklers or that they're something else because we believe that we're ultimately right and we stop judging our actions and our beliefs on the Bible, and we judge by what we think is comfortable. Right? We prefer this version of Christendom, and we prefer that we get rid of whether it's the ultra spiritualist side in Pentecostals, the legalist side in Baptists, the you know the Orthodox orthodoxy or the leadership of Catholicism, right? We all fight against one of those things, and we don't think about what that means for Christendom, and we don't unify. We divide amongst ourselves because we're fighting for what we think is right, and we want all of the other views of Christendom to be silenced.
That raises a really interesting point. I was having a conversation with some guy earlier this week at the climbing gym. Because one of the things that I like within coming to faith just recently, earlier this year, one of the things was that like some aspects of like some like what are they called? Like what is the word?
Denominations.
Denominations.
Oh,
Thank
there you
you.
go. Yeah.
Like some of the denominations just appear more outwardly hateful. Um, and I was talking to him, and it's like, yeah, no, like I agree that some might, but it's also like they apply to different areas. You know, we should really be working like, what do we have in common with these people, rather than like what separates us here. And that was a thought that I thought was really interesting, and I'm going back to get coffee with that guy sometime soon, just because it was a real eye opener for me. Because like in the same sense that Putin doesn't really think he's evil, I didn't think that I was really acting evil and like saying, oh yeah, Catholics, they're driving people away from the church, when it's not necessarily all them or all Catholics or all of that. It might just be like some dispute from Catholicism, like back in 400 or something. Um, and that's just something that I think that's a really good talking point, because I just like what you're saying about like we need to be more united and stuff. I just kind of feel like instead of focusing on the differences that we all like between us over here being like hyper spiritual and them over there being hyper legalist, at the end of the day, we're all worshiping Christ, what he stands for, what he preached, and not necessarily saying that one person is right or wrong from the other. Like we should just be focusing on like, is this the best way that we can be loving? And whether or not we disagree on it, if we disagree that this might not be the best way, then let's focus on some other part, let's focus on something else that we can be uniting around.
But it's not something you should ignore either, right?
Mm.
It's something that needs to be talked about, right, and discussed, and understand why you differ, so that you understand your beliefs in that particular field. But this was more of a discussion on us thinking we're doing the right thing and creating division because we think we're doing the right thing, right? And that's really what the discussion was. But a united church is always better than a divided church.
Mm.
But that's how we're doing it daily, right? Is we're saying that what we're doing is right, therefore all other Christendoms are wrong, and that's not prevent that, that's not the way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as long as we as Christians are united in the truth of the gospel and the whole truth of the gospel, that's going to be the critical pivotal point of our movements to get the truth out to the world. Because obviously we don't want to compromise the truth. You can't compromise the truth. The truth is the truth, and God is the one who has the ultimate authority to do what he wants over this earth, with which he has dominion over. Right. So as long as we are in accord as the church on the gospel, which is that God created man, man chose to disobey, God chose to redeem us, and eventually permanently redeem us through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross for our sins, and that faith and faith alone is the only pre-qualification. Well, repentance and faith combined, repentance from sin and faith in Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross and accepting him as Savior, is the only qualification of the gospel that we necessarily need to be agreed on and promoting to the world. So anyone who's not doing that in the name of Christianity is someone who's contributing to the problem within the church. And obviously we've all contributed to it before, obviously, regardless of what side, what denomination we're on. We all have, simply just because we're broken people. We haven't always been the perfect representation of the gospel of Jesus in the world, or in the church for that matter. But as long as we're united in that truth, that's the truth that can go out and change the world. That's the objective truth that can go out and get our minds off of right and wrong and focus strictly and more so primarily on God and what God wants out of his most prized creation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like going off of like what Andreas was saying then, like if we're talking like about like how to stop these differences, like focusing on the I'm right, you're wrong, what should we be doing instead? Like what aspects of our life should we, if we're over here saying those guys are wrong, we're right, what should we be doing instead? What do you guys have to say on that?
You can
I
go
think
for it
it's
first if you want. Yeah, there you go. Go for it.
I think it's really focusing on you and your faith, right? That's where you should be starting, right? Right. Making sure that making sure that you have the plank out of your own eye before removing the speck from somebody else's eye. As you grow and develop in faith, that's quite important. You building your faith up, you getting stronger and using that, right? Having the Holy Spirit use that to spread your faith to others is the way to do it, right? Rather than saying, well, Baptists are a bunch of legalists um, that don't have any fun. You can't dance, you can't watch movies, whatever, right? And before you knock them down and say they're obviously wrong, right? It should be a focus on you and your faith and what you understand about Jesus, right? And that you truly know Jesus, right? That's where you start. And from that, you radiate and other people will see and catch on to that, and that'll grow in whatever circle you're in, right? Because if you're focusing on your faith, you're not focusing on Chris's faith, you're not focusing on my faith, you're focusing on your own faith, and that'll change you, and that'll eventually change others, right? It's your house, you're getting in order first.
Exactly. I think one of the biggest contributors to a lot of the issues we see in regards to this particular issue is that people don't have in their own minds and in their own hearts an accurate representation of the true God. And that stems off to a whole bunch of other issues that we see. Like people will read Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus says, don't judge, and they'll just cap it at don't judge. They won't read the rest of the verse where it says, don't judge lest you be judged by the same standard with which you judge others. So it's very important that we have the full picture of the God that we serve, the God of the universe, in our minds, so we can appropriately portray him to the world. And that can also cut down on a significant number of issues that we have within the church, where a lot of Christians are out here saying, No, judging is not good. Jesus never called us to judge. Actually, he did. He did. Jesus never called us to not judge. What he did is he gave us godly parameters of how to judge in a way that is leading to a more peaceful society where God's presence and peace is brought down within society in a better, more efficient manner, right?
Mhm. I think that raises an interesting point, though, because that's another area of disagreement where you can be like, yeah, no, God doesn't want us to judge, or and saying that's part of the one true God, and being like, no, he says we want to be judging in a godly way. Like, how would God be judging this? We want to judge by God's morals, God's ethics. And I guess the question there is just, how do we figure out who that one true God is? How do we figure out all of his character? Because it's been a big disagreement across history, and especially since the Protestant Reformation, there's been a lot of disagreement, a lot of conflict there over disagreeing on whether or not this is something that God does want, the one true God. This is within his characters, and there'll be other people within the faith being like, no, that is not it. So what do you guys say? How do we figure out that difference?
So there are 40 different authors and 1,500 years worth of time that went into creating this document that we refer to as the Bible. Now, I know it might seem very elementary in thought, but literally, what is the Bible? People call the Bible a lot of things: a philosophy book, a history book, the record of a really good guy in Jesus who taught a lot of good things. Ultimately, the Bible is the only true inspiration of God and revelation of God to us, his creation as people, his most prized creation. He sprinkles throughout scripture different bits and pieces of his character, whether it be directly with something that he directly said that someone wrote down, one of the authors wrote down, or whether it be through someone else, a character, a person that he revealed his character through in what they said and what they communicated that was written down in the Bible too. So it just goes back to the idea of taking our minds more so off of the idea of what's good and what's bad, what's good, what's evil, and focusing on reading and understanding truly what is the God that I serve? Who is he? What does he want from me? And when you focus on what God wants for your life and you go through the Bible and you find little instances, not even little, well, I guess they are little, but they occur very frequently throughout the Bible, right? When you go through and you identify the God that you serve and all the different aspects of what he wants you to do to serve and worship him, then that's where you get really focused on who you're serving and what you're doing and what your purpose is, in my opinion.
I dig it. Just one thing that comes to mind though is like earlier in the summer when I moved up to the mountains, I was doing some church hopping, just trying to figure out where I would ground my faith while I was up there, not going to my home church. And I stumbled across a church who used the Passion Bible to preach out of. And see, you're laughing at that one because it raises another point. The Passion Bible is not considered to be the entire full works of what the Bible was really intended to be. But how can we properly point at them and say you are wrong in this, without first examining ourselves and all of the translations that came within the widely accepted Bible that convey different ideas at different points?
Andreas, you want to take that one first or me?
So yeah, saying how do you know which translations are good and which ones are bad?
In a sense, yeah.
Well, there's a spectrum here, right? We like to use the spectrum in the modern day, but this is a real spectrum. Between a formal translation versus a dynamic translation, and then beyond that being a paraphrase. So what we did, what English speakers have done, is we have taken the Greek text of the Bible and we've translated it to English in various versions that all get their little 3 to 4 letter acronym. Right, you've got your NIV, your KJV, your NET, your NASB, your English ESV,
NLT.
etc. NLT. And all of those translations will map on the spectrum from formal translation to dynamic translation. You also have paraphrase, i.e., the message. I guess you could consider the Passion a paraphrase, even though it's kind of a paraphrase that's been expanded. So, an expanded paraphrase, which is a really weird word. And the amplified version as well is also a paraphrase that's been expanded. So, what a formal translation of the Bible means is they took the Greek text, the Aramaic text, and they have translated it as directly into English as they could. Okay? So things are going to be phrased not great all the time. It's not going to make the clearest of sense, but they are trying to directly map the original language straight to English. A dynamic translation, on the other hand, is going to take the original language, the Greek, and change it to make more sense in the culture and context of the new reader. A good way to explain this is I was reading a book. I don't know if it was by Jim Elliot or about Jim Elliot from somebody else, right? The missionaries that got killed, I forget in which country. And they were talking about, I think it was by Jim Elliot's wife, and they were talking about how they changed the story in the translation for these tribal people. Changed the story from, you want to build your house on the rock to you want to build your house on the sand, which is the complete reverse of the way that we translated it into English, right? Because in their culture, if you were to build a house on rock, your house isn't going to remain because it's going to crumble and get washed away. Whereas when they build their house in sand, right, they drive pylons of wood into the dirt, into the sand to hold that home steady. And so they said, instead of translating it to rock where the house is going to crumble in their mind, right, because that's their cultural context, they translated it to you're going to build your house on the sand of Jesus, right? You're going to and have that be your answer, which is the complete reverse of the English, right? And that would be an example of a dynamic translation, right? You're taking that Greek and you're saying, okay, even though the Greek's saying, hey, you're going to build the house on the rock, right? We're going to say it's going to build the house on the sand and say that the bad thing's to build it on the rock, right? Because they're trying to get the meaning across to the culture that's being understood, that's trying to understand it. So when you're picking a translation now, you're deciding, you as the reader, you as the scholar, you as the person who's trying to understand Jesus and understand his word, you are actively choosing where on the spectrum of formal translation to dynamic translation you want to pick your translation to be, right? Knowing the downfalls of more formal and knowing the downfalls of more dynamic, and you're making that choice and how you're going to read the word. I read the word in multiple translations because that's the way I do it, because it allows me to see, okay, here's how a more dynamic, say NIV is going to translate that text, and here's what NASB is going to say in a more formal way, or ESV in a more formal way, or the Net Bible where it has the translator notes which explains why they translated something into the way they said they were going to do it. Paraphrases, on the other hand, don't fall on that spectrum. They're past dynamic, in which they take a translated English version and paraphrase or expand on it or something like that in order to make it more flowery or easier to understand, i.e. the message making it easier to understand, right? They take the English and they paraphrase it into a paraphrase. And that's what that means. And that's where you got to pick what you're going to do, right? And that's how you're going to pick which translation you're going to read from to determine, okay, this is how I'm going to, this is where I'm going to pick on the spectrum, and this is what I know my downsides are for reading it from that point, because you're not reading it in the Greek unless you learn Greek. You're not reading it in Hebrew unless you learn Hebrew, and you're not reading it in Aramaic unless you learn Aramaic. So that's where that's going to be.
Sweet, I
Yeah.
dig it.
Yeah, no, that's true. I definitely agree. That's it goes to show that there are different interpretations of the Bible that have been written over time. I think that, in my opinion, the ones that are more true to the original text, ones like the NASB, the KJV, the NKJV, ESV, the ones that are more traditional are probably better to get a more traditionally accurate view of who God is. And then you got, like you mentioned, the Passion Bible. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that's the one with like the Brian Simmons guy who like heard from an angel, something like that.
I
He
don't
said,
know.
yeah, he said he got some revelation from an angel who was telling him, yeah, you need to write this down in scripture. Canon is closed. The canon is closed. Ain't nobody else hearing from God today. Let me guarantee you. And if they're hearing directly from God, it needs to be written down and added to scripture, and we need to take note of it. It's not happening today. So I think as it pertains to getting to understand who God is in the most accurate view, reading one of those more traditional interpretations or translations is the best, most effective way to do so.
Yeah.
Sick.
Well, I need to correct you just a little bit there, Chris. KJV is not based on the same documents that modern translations are based on. I think it's called the Texas Reciprocus or something on that sort, which is, I believe, give me a second, I'll tell you more clearly. TX Source Bible.
Well, I guess that would be because it's probably older too, right? It's like old KJV is, right?
Well, yeah, it's from, is it Texas? It sounds like the state of Texas. Is it Reciprocus Bible? Yes. Okay, yeah, it's the Texas Reciprocus Bible is what that's translated on, which is different than what we have as the earliest texts of the Greek. The what's written in that translation is distinctly different than the original Greek. As close to as we have gotten to the original source in Greek. It's yeah. So KJV is based off that collection of documents. It's not significant different, but it is different than the oldest versions of the Greek that we have found.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense. I can see that. It was also written a long time ago before they had access to those transcripts. So that would make sense if that is the case, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why some people argue that it's better. They're saying that the inspired word of God is that Greek that was found way later than the earlier Greek translations. So that's where that comes from, and that's why there's an argument among Christendom about is the KJV the only real translation of the Bible versus not, right? Because some people think that the later texts of Greek, which the KJV is based on, are superior than the older Greek texts, which is interesting.
That's very interesting. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, it's good stuff. That's good stuff to talk about. Effectively, what it boils down to is find a translation that represents the God of the universe accurately, to some extent, to a decently accurate extent, right? Well, we got a few minutes left. So, in closing, what can we take away from this whole Russia-Ukraine situation with the sort of abuse of power or different opinions on right and wrong? How can we take what we've learned from this situation as a whole and apply it in our lives to give us confidence that we are living in an objectively pleasing manner, so to speak?
I guess just reading your Bible, man. Just going back to the source of what is right and wrong, and just analyzing it against all aspects of your current life. Going to God in prayer, going to Jesus in prayer, and being like, hey, where's the plank in my eye right now before I point out a speck in someone else's? What can I do to work on that? And then, go from there. Back up what you hear in scripture. And then just think of ways to be applying that to your own personal life.
That's good. I like that. That's good. Couldn't have summarized it better myself. Andreas?
Yeah, I agree with Gavin there. Before you make actions, right? Before you do something, make sure that you're aligned with what Scripture says, right? You're not going to go punch your next door neighbor because that's the way to do life, because they're invading on your property boundary in your backyard. That's listening and reading the word is very important, and that's what we have to do first as Christians. And if you were in a place like Putin, right, you got to think, is how I'm leading the country here going to be glorifying to God, and is it what's best, right? Because Putin could easily say, I'm going to work on Russia first before invading Ukraine, right? He could have done that, but he didn't, because he thought that the Ukrainians were more of an existential threat.
Yeah, that's good. That's definitely true, guys. It just gets back to knowing who God is. When you're focused on knowing who God is instead of what's good and what's bad, then you quickly find out that God is infinitely better than good, and it'll manifest in your life, not in the sense that people call manifest today, but it will show up. It will show up in your life is what I'm trying to convey here. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for you personally. You'll feel more confident in yourself. It's a good thing for society. It's a good thing for society to have a ground upon which they feel like they can have open discourse and not feel like someone's opinion of good is better than this other person's opinion of good. It just provides stability in a world that stability is not currently valued the way it's supposed to be. And I think that's good. I think it's good for society. For anyone who does not believe in God, my prayer is that you do end up coming to know him eventually. Trust me, he's pretty cool. As I'm sure Gavin can attest to, like you said, he's a relatively new Christian. He's a baby Christian.
I'm a little baby Christian, but I will also add on to that. Like, if you're not a believer right now, go sit down and just, even if you don't believe in a God right now, just go sit down with someone who might, see what differences that you actually do have with those people, and see how much common ground that you do share with those people. It works a little bit of magic on you. Speaking from experience.
I believe it 100%, man. That's good stuff. But yeah, I mean, we're all in this together, right? We're just the human race, God's prized creation, just trudging through life together until Jesus comes back, or we all go to heaven. So until that day comes, we're going to continue seeking him. The train is always going to stop at a stop near you. Never feel like you cannot hop on at that stop. Well, I'm going to end this show here. This has been the first episode. I don't know if I had a voice crack there. It's been like 2 hours. If I did, it's expected. Thank you for listening to this episode of the A to G Lifestyle Podcast. We truly hope you enjoyed listening to this on whatever platform you did, whether it be YouTube, Twitch, Spotify, the works. Thank you for tuning in. Your listenership is definitely appreciated. Go follow us over on our social medias at AG Lifestyle Pod. And until next week, we will see you guys soon. Hopefully you have a great rest of your week. Don't do anything too crazy over this New Year's Eve, New Year's Day holiday that we have going on. But yeah, we'll be back with you guys in about a week or so. Anybody got any outros that they'd like to get out of the way?
There's two races. There's the human race and there's NASCAR.
Oh my!
We're in it together.
I was not expecting that. Gavin, I stand wholly corrected. Entirely.
You can't forget about the second one, man. Dude, you can't forget about NASCAR.
Dude, how are you gonna make me look stupid like that? Man, dang. Dang. Sorry, guys. I'm gonna correct what I said at the beginning of this podcast. There are, in fact, two races. The evidence suggests. All righty. Peace out, guys. We'll see y'all next week.
See you next year.